My name is Evelyn Hart. A week before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother that read, "Dinner's at 6 on Thursday. If you're free, stop by." No emojis, no warmth, just logistics, as if I were a distant acquaintance and not their eldest daughter. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a single word. Sure. There was no reason to feel surprised. They had forgotten I existed for years, birthdays missed, milestones unmentioned, messages left unanswered. In my family, the spotlight had always belonged to my sister, Claire. She was the golden one. The topic that filled every conversation, the pride they polished in front of guests. When they spoke of her new boutique, her designer collaborations, or her engagement to a lawyer from Chicago, the table came alive with laughter. My name only surfaced when someone needed something. "Evelyn, grab more ice," or "Evelyn, can you take the photo?" So when that brief Thanksgiving invitation came through, it didn't feel like an olive branch. It felt like a formality, an afterthought. Still, I said yes. Sometimes, you don't return for family, you return for closure. Have you ever been forgotten by the very people meant to love you, until your silence became the loudest thing in the room? Tell me where you're watching from. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, the kind of place where everyone knew your last name, your father's job, and what kind of pie your mother brought to the church bake sale. On Sundays, we sat in the same pew third from the front, left side our family name, the Harts, spoken in a tone that carried a certain pride. But that pride never belonged to me. It was stitched entirely around my sister, Claire, whose every smile was a promise of the family's social standing. In that town, your worth wasn't measured by who you were, it was measured by how proudly your parents introduced you after service. And mine always went the same way. "This is Evelyn, Claire's sister." The pause before my name always felt longer than it should, like they had to search for it. Every Thanksgiving, the church hosted a potluck dinner for the congregation. Long tables filled the fellowship hall, each neatly decorated with handwritten place cards. I remember the first year I realized something about those cards that never changed. My name was always spelled wrong. Evelyn. Evelyn. Even Evelyn. Never quite me. And my seat? Always at the far corner of the table, near the stack of napkins and the jug of cranberry punch, the spot where the light flickered weakest. I used to wonder if anyone else noticed the mistake, but no one ever did. Everyone was too busy laughing with Claire. She'd run around the room in her little lace dress, reciting her Thanksgiving poem to the pastor's wife, while people clapped and said things like, "That girl's going to make the Harts proud." I sat quietly, smiling when they looked my way, pretending I didn't mind that the only person who asked if I wanted more turkey was the church janitor. The moment that branded itself into me, though, wasn't Thanksgiving, it was my 10th birthday. It fell on the same weekend as Claire's first major dance recital, and in our house, that meant one thing: the living room became hers. I woke up that morning to the sound of my mother's voice singing happy birthday to Claire as she helped her into her glittering costume. I waited in my room, watching the sun trace across the floorboards, half expecting someone to knock, to say, "Happy birthday, Evie." No one did. By noon, the house was full of guests, relatives, neighbors, the local dance coach. Pink balloons covered the ceiling, and a cake sat on the table that read, "Congratulations, Claire," in swirls of white frosting. My mother brushed past me with a camera, telling me to stand to the side so I wouldn't block the light. When I asked, quietly, if we could maybe light some candles for me after, she smiled distractedly and said, "Oh honey, let's not complicate things. Today's already full." Now, I clapped for my sister, just like everyone else did. I smiled for pictures that weren't meant to include me. Later, when the guests had left and the confetti lay dull on the carpet, I found a small gift on the counter with my name scribbled wrong again, to Evelyn, from Mom and Dad. Inside was a spiral notebook, the kind my father brought home from accounting conferences. The logo on the cover read, "Midwest Financial Expo." It was thin, ordinary, and smelled faintly of printer ink. I held it in my hands for a long time, realizing this was my birthday gift. My father passed by as I stood there, his tie loosened, his smile polite but distant. "You can use that to take notes for school," he said. "You've always been the organized one." Then he kissed my forehead and went to help Claire pack for her recital trip. That night, while the house slept, I opened the notebook and wrote a single line across the first page. I was here. I didn't know why I wrote it, only that it felt like proof of something no one else seemed to see. After that, I began to collect small moments of being unseen like entries in an invisible ledger. When the family took their annual Christmas photo, I was the one behind the camera. When neighbors came over, I was the one setting the table while my parents told stories about Claire's dance trophies. If something went wrong, the broken vase, the misplaced check, it was never her fault. "You're older," my mother would remind me. "You understand better, you're stronger. Let your sister have her moment." That phrase became a kind of anthem in our house. "You're strong, let her shine." It sounded noble when she said it, but what it really meant was fade a little more. Over time, I learned to make myself small, to listen instead of speak, to smile in family photos even when no one thought to print one for my room. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from standing right beside people who look through you. I lived in that silence, dressed it up with obedience and politeness, until it felt almost comfortable. But sometimes, late at night, I'd take out that old notebook, the one with the company logo, and write the things I wished I could say. I wrote about the day I realized the word family didn't guarantee belonging. I wrote about the way my name looked when spelled wrong, how it made me feel like a placeholder in my own story. And in the margins, I wrote the one sentence that kept me going. "Someday, they'll remember I was here." The first time I remember the silence feeling physical, like something I could touch, was at the county science fair in 8th grade. I had spent 3 weeks building a small wind turbine from scrap parts I'd scavenged behind the school gym. An old fan motor, a bicycle rim, a few pieces of plywood my teacher helped me cut straight. When it spun under the gym's fluorescent lights, the blades shimmered faintly, catching the air just enough to make a tiny bulb glow. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and for me, that was everything. I remember my hands trembling when they called my name for first place. The applause filled the hall like a wave, echoing off the metal bleachers. For a split second, I imagined my parents in the crowd, mom with her camera, dad clapping proudly, maybe Claire rolling her eyes but smiling anyway. But when I looked toward the seats, the row that should have been theirs was empty. The folding chairs sat neatly in a line, untouched, the paper program resting perfectly where someone had placed it hours earlier. After the ceremony, I lingered, pretending to organize my materials while the other families packed up, laughing and taking pictures. A few parents congratulated me out of politeness, their voices gentle with pity. When the janitor started stacking chairs, I finally went outside. The air was sharp and cold, and the parking lot lights hummed above the cracked pavement. Our family car wasn't there. I stood under the flickering lamppost for nearly 20 minutes before my teacher, Mr. Cole, offered me a ride home. He didn't ask where my parents were. He just handed me a warm cup of cocoa from a thermos and said, "You did good, kid. Don't let anyone make you feel small about it." When I walked into the house, the lights were on, and laughter spilled from the kitchen. My mother was kneeling beside Claire, pinning the hem of her prom dress, her voice full of excitement. "You look like a dream," she said. My father was filming on his old camcorder, narrating proudly about the upcoming big night. I stood in the doorway, the metal ribbon still around my neck, waiting for someone to look up. No one did. When my mother finally noticed me, she smiled distractedly. "Sweetheart, sorry we couldn't make it. You know how hard these fittings are to reschedule." She waved a hand toward the table. "There's leftover lasagna if you're hungry." I nodded, set the medal down quietly beside the sewing machine, and said nothing. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, the house dark except for the small lamp above the sink. The metal caught the light, glinting weakly against the wood. I traced its edges with my finger and thought about the moment they'd called my name, the burst of applause that had seemed to fill my chest. Now, it felt hollow. It's strange how quickly pride turns to ash when there's no one to share it with. I took a bite of cold lasagna and told myself it was fine, that I didn't need anyone to clap for me. But somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered, "You deserve to be seen." From that day on, I stopped asking anyone to come to my events. When I made it to the state debate semifinals, I didn't even mention it at dinner. When the school printed my essay in the local paper, I clipped the page myself and folded it into my notebook. My family never noticed, and I stopped trying to make them. I learned a kind of quiet efficiency, how to celebrate privately, how to exist without interruption. But the humiliation came in smaller doses too, scattered like glass shards across the years. There was the time my mother hosted a dinner for Claire's dance troupe. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, the table glittering with her best china. I helped in the kitchen all afternoon, chopping vegetables, polishing glasses, arranging flowers. When everyone sat down, I realized there wasn't a plate set for me. I stood behind my chair, smiling awkwardly until one of the girls asked, "Aren't you eating?" My mother looked up from the end of the table, frowning slightly as if she just noticed I existed. "Oh, Evelyn, I thought you were serving tonight." I nodded automatically, pretending that was always the plan. I spent the rest of the evening refilling drinks and clearing plates, trying to ignore the empty space at the table where my meal should have been. After the guests left, I stayed behind to wash the dishes. The water was too hot, burning my hands, but I didn't turn it down. I liked the sting, it made me feel awake. I scrubbed until the last plate shone and the kitchen gleamed. When I finally turned off the faucet, the silence roared back in. My parents had gone to bed, Claire already asleep. I stood alone amid the clean counters, the scent of lemon soap thick in the air, and stared at the single, unused dinner plate still sitting on the counter. I wiped it dry and stacked it neatly with the others. That became my pattern: serve, clean, disappear. As I got older, the dynamic didn't change, it just became more refined, quieter. Claire's successes were public articles, recitals, photos framed in the hallway. Mine were practical, invisible, good grades, scholarships, the part-time job that helped pay her costumes. My parents liked to call me the responsible one, which was their polite way of saying the unremarkable one. When relatives visited, they'd beam at Claire and say, "She's got that sparkle," then turn to me and add, "And you so helpful," always behind the scenes. It's amazing how words meant as compliments can sound like shackles. I learned to translate them silently in my head. Sparkle meant worthy of love. Helpful meant background noise. Each time they forgot me, it didn't feel like a single moment, it felt cumulative, like drops of water hollowing stone. Slowly, invisibly, they sculpted me into the dependable shadow orbiting their Sunday. By the time I turned 16, I had mastered the art of being present without taking up space. When guests came over, I refilled drinks before anyone asked. When the oven timer rang, I was already at the door. My mother once told a friend, half jokingly, "Evelyn's like magic, the second you need something, she's there." They laughed. I smiled. But I knew the truth. Being there wasn't the same as being seen. That year, during another one of Claire's celebrations, her acceptance into a regional dance academy, I stood by the sink, watching through the reflection on the kitchen window. The table was full again, laughter bouncing off the walls. I noticed, almost absently, that one plate at the far end hadn't been filled. Mine. The silverware gleamed beside it, untouched. I could have stepped forward, claimed it, sat down like I belonged. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up the dish and carried it to the counter, setting it carefully beside the sink. My mother's voice floated over the laughter, soft and familiar. "You're strong, Evelyn. Let her enjoy her moment." I nodded to no one and turned on the faucet. The water hissed, and the laughter blurred into a distant hum. That night, I understood something for the first time: they weren't going to change. The empty plate would always be mine. The only question was how long I'd keep serving a table that never had a seat for me. My grandmother, Helen Moore, lived 2 streets over from us, in a small white house that smelled like cinnamon and nutmeg no matter the season. She was my mother's mother, though they couldn't have been more different. Where Mom's world was spotless and performative, Grandma's was warm and cluttered, the kind of house that held its breath between batches of fresh pie and radio static from old jazz stations. I used to escape there after school under the pretense of helping her bake, though what I was really doing was learning how to breathe. She never asked about grades or recitals. She just handed me an apron and said, "You measure the sugar, I'll handle the spice." Together, we'd hum along to Ella Fitzgerald while the crust browned slowly in the oven. The kitchen windows fogged from the heat, and for those few hours, the world shrank to the smell of butter, cinnamon, and belonging. One afternoon, after yet another of Claire's victory parties, the kind where I ended up washing silverware until midnight, I walked into Grandma's house without knocking. She looked up from her rocking chair, eyes sharp behind her glasses, and said simply, "Rough night?" I didn't have to answer. She pointed toward the counter where 2 pie crusts waited and added, "Good. Anger makes the best dough." I laughed in spite of myself, and the tension in my shoulders finally loosened. While we worked, she told me stories about her own girlhood, the war years, the ration cards, the times she'd baked apple pies for the neighbors just to keep her hands busy when her brothers didn't write home. She had this way of slipping wisdom into her words so gently that you didn't realize you were being taught. When the pies came out golden and perfect, she slid one toward me and said, "You don't have to earn love by being useful, Evelyn. People will try to make you think that, but it's a trap." I looked down, tracing a finger along the warm crust. "Then how do you know if you're enough?" She tilted her head, studying me for a long moment before answering. "Because you wake up every day and try again. Because you're still here. That's enough." Her voice softened. "And don't mistake silence for failure. Just because there's no applause doesn't mean you're not shining." That sentence rooted itself inside me so deeply that even now, years later, I can still hear her say it. At the time, it made me cry. No one had ever told me I was shining. At home, I was the steady one, the invisible one, the girl who filled glasses and cleared plates. But in Grandma's kitchen, I was something else entirely, a person worth talking to. Before I left that evening, she went into the small study off her kitchen and returned with something wrapped in a faded scarf. "Here," she said, placing it in my hands. "I was saving this for when you were ready to start telling your own stories." Inside the scarf was a small leather-bound notebook, the corners worn soft from years of use. The cover smelled faintly of cedar and ink. My name wasn't written on it, but somehow, it felt more like mine than anything I'd ever owned. "It used to be my journal when I was your age," she said. "I wrote everything here, recipes, poems, prayers, things I couldn't say out loud. I figured you might need something like that too." I turned it over carefully, as though it might crumble, and whispered, "What should I write?" She smiled. "Your voice. Before the world tries to write it for you." I didn't know what she meant then, not fully, but I would spend years unpacking that sentence. That night, I lay in bed with the leather notebook on my chest, the smell of cinnamon still clinging to my hair. I flipped it open to the first page, where Grandma's neat cursive filled 6 lines. Her handwriting looped and danced across the yellowed paper. "The hardest battles are fought in silence. The truest victories leave no sound." Beneath it, she had written one more line, as if she knew I'd find it when I needed it most. "Keep your fire low and steady, child. It will last longer that way." From that day forward, whenever things felt unbearable, another forgotten dinner, another family photo I wasn't in, I went to Grandma's house. Sometimes we baked, sometimes we just sat quietly, peeling apples or listening to the rain against the porch roof. She never tried to fix my family, never told me to demand more from them. Instead, she taught me how to build a world within myself where I could survive the noise of being ignored. And little by little, I started to understand what she meant about silence. It wasn't a punishment, it was a space, waiting for me to fill it with my own sound. I began writing every night, first about small things: the smell of wet leaves, the way sunlight caught on the kitchen floor, the ache in my chest when no one noticed. Then bigger things: dreams, goals, blueprints of who I wanted to become. That leather notebook became my anchor, the proof that I existed beyond the roles they gave me. Whenever I felt invisible, I'd run my fingers over its worn spine and remind myself. Someone once saw me clearly enough to hand me this. Years later, when I'd build a company from nothing, when people would ask how it all began, I'd think back to that house that smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg, to a woman with kind eyes and strong hands who believed in quiet light. Because Grandma Helen had been right all along, there doesn't have to be applause for you to shine. Some lights are meant to glow softly, steady, and unseen, until the day they illuminate everything. By the time I turned 17, the rhythm of my life had settled into something both predictable and invisible. School, work, home, repeat. I didn't go to dances or join clubs. I preferred the hum of circuits to the noise of crowds. While other kids traded gossip in the cafeteria, I sat in the corner of the library, taking apart an old radio I'd found in a thrift store bin. The smell of dust and solder made more sense to me than small talk ever could. Machines didn't forget you. If something didn't work, there was always a reason, one you could trace, test, fix. People weren't like that. People broke you, then acted surprised when you stopped trying. Grandma Helen's leather notebook came with me everywhere. It lived in my backpack between textbooks and half-finished circuit sketches. I filled its pages with diagrams, stray equations, and bits of code I didn't yet understand. The library's ancient computers became my sanctuary. I stayed late after closing, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, as I taught myself to code through outdated online tutorials and PDF manuals no one read anymore. Logic made sense. Code was honest, it didn't play favorites, didn't ask for approval. If you gave it the right input, it gave you the truth. I liked that. When I graduated high school, I didn't have a college acceptance party or a new car with a bow on top like Claire did. She'd already been accepted into a fashion program in New York, and my parents threw her a farewell dinner with gold balloons spelling her name. I spent that night working the closing shift at a shipping warehouse by the highway. It was supposed to be temporary just until I figured out what came next, but somehow it became my classroom. The warehouse was an ecosystem of chaos. Packages piled higher than people, labels smudged, scanners lagging. Most nights, we were short-staffed, the conveyor belts screeching as they tried to keep up. But I noticed patterns in the mess: how certain routes always jammed at the same time, how certain zones overflowed while others sat half-empty. One night, while waiting for a late truck, I sketched the entire floor layout in my notebook. The next morning, I borrowed an old laptop from the manager and stayed after my shift to write a simple program that tracked package flow by zone. It wasn't much, just lines of code and a crude interface, but after a week of testing, efficiency went up almost 20%. When I showed the results to my supervisor, he looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "You did this?" he asked, scrolling through the data. "On your own?" I nodded, embarrassed. "You're wasting your time out there sorting boxes," he muttered. "You should be running logistics." It was the first time anyone had said I should be something instead of shouldn't. I went home that morning with grease on my hands, exhaustion in my bones, and a quiet, flickering sense of purpose in my chest. For the first time, I understood what Grandma meant when she said silence wasn't failure, it was space. That warehouse was my silence, and I was filling it. I enrolled in online community college classes at night, studying computer science and data analytics. I couldn't afford tuition all at once, so I worked double shifts, often falling asleep at my desk between assignments. But I didn't mind. Every late night felt like a small rebellion against the narrative that I was background noise. Code became my language of safety. Numbers didn't lie, algorithms didn't play favorites. I could build systems that treated every variable the same. That idea fascinated me. Machines didn't care if you were the golden child or the forgotten one, they only cared about balance, about logic. If you taught them right, they could be fairer than people. Somewhere deep down, I think I started chasing that fairness, trying to build it where it had never existed for me. Around that time, the small-town retailers I delivered to started complaining about shortages and delays. Orders that should have arrived in 2 days took 5. Shelves stayed empty while storage rooms overflowed. I watched store managers panic, trying to make sense of spreadsheets that didn't match reality. One night, while sorting boxes, I asked a question out loud that made one of my coworkers laugh. What if the system could see where things were stuck before people did? He thought I was joking. I wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I began designing a small script to track real-time stock levels using barcode scans and delivery logs. It was primitive, built in Python with data pulled from open-source libraries, but it worked. The system could predict which locations were at risk of shortages 2 days in advance. I showed it to my supervisor again, half expecting him to shrug, but this time he called his district manager. Within a month, they were using my model across 4 warehouses. When the quarterly report came back showing a 15% cost reduction, the company offered me a small bonus and a new role, junior data analyst. It wasn't much, but to me it felt monumental. I remember sitting on the loading dock that night, looking at the glowing warehouse lights reflected in puddles from the rain. I thought about all the times I'd been overlooked, all the empty chairs and forgotten plates. Maybe this was what it meant to build something that noticed, something that worked because I did. I opened Grandma's notebook and wrote one sentence across the next blank page. If machines can be fair, maybe people can learn from them. That sentence became the quiet seed of everything that came after. I didn't realize it then, but it would grow into the philosophy behind my future company, the belief that fairness could be engineered, that data could be a mirror showing where humanity failed to balance itself. The following year, I moved to the city and took on every job I could find: warehouse data entry by day, coding freelance projects by night, tutoring high school students on weekends. I learned fast, broke things faster, and built even faster after that. My world became a blur of glowing screens and black coffee, of silent mornings watching the sun rise over the fog while lines of code ran across my monitor. I didn't have anyone cheering me on, but I didn't need it. Every script that worked was a whisper of validation. Every bug I fixed a small act of defiance. Sometimes, when exhaustion hit hard, I'd take out Grandma's leather notebook, its edges now frayed, and read her line again. Just because there's no applause doesn't mean you're not shining. I'd smile, wipe the crumbs of cold pizza off my keyboard, and keep typing. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was building something that would make the world see itself clearly, honestly, and without bias. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning everything changed didn't look like much of anything at all. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray Midwestern morning that smells like damp concrete and diesel from trucks idling outside the warehouse. I was sitting at my usual desk in the back corner, half listening to the hum of conveyor belts while I tweaked another version of the supply chain script. My supervisor, Rick, shuffled in holding a clipboard and 2 cups of coffee. "You've got a visitor," he said, setting one of the cups down beside me. "Corporate wants to know how you managed to save them 18% on distribution costs last quarter." I blinked. 18? He grinned. "Yeah, 18. You do realize that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?" By the time I looked up, a man in a navy jacket was standing at the edge of my cubicle, watching the rotating graphs on my monitor. He wasn't from corporate. He introduced himself as Mark Ellison, a regional logistics consultant who also happened to invest in early-stage tech. He'd heard about my optimization tool through a company report and wanted to understand the human behind the math. I remember how awkward I felt, hands stained with ink and engine grease, trying to explain my project while the forklifts beeped in the background. But Mark didn't seem to care about appearances. He asked smart questions about scalability, data sources, and automation potential, and for the first time in my life, someone's curiosity felt like belief. Before leaving, he handed me a card embossed with a minimalist logo and said, "If you ever decide to build something bigger, call me. You've got an eye for systems most people never notice." That night, I sat on my narrow apartment bed, turning the card over and over in my hands. Build something bigger. The words pulsed like a heartbeat. I wasn't sure what bigger meant yet, but I could feel the door creaking open somewhere inside me. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I studied logistics startups, watched endless TED Talks, read every article I could find about predictive analytics. I didn't have investors, a team, or even a proper computer, just an old ThinkPad, a borrowed Wi-Fi signal, and Grandma Helen's notebook sitting beside me. One night, half asleep over my keyboard, I found an online application for a technology accelerator program in Chicago. They offered housing, mentorship, and a small grant to promising founders with socially conscious tech ideas. I hesitated before clicking submit. Who was I to think I belonged there? Still, I attached my prototype and wrote a single sentence in the essay section. I believe fairness can be engineered. 2 weeks later, an email arrived with the subject line, "Congratulations, Evelyn." My hands shook as I read it again and again. I had been accepted into the program with a full scholarship. For the first time in my life, I was leaving Indiana not because I was running away, but because I finally had somewhere to go. Chicago was louder, faster, and colder than anything I'd known. The first night, I stood in front of the high-rise dorms the program had provided, clutching my backpack and breathing in the city air that smelled like ambition and rain. Inside, a dozen other founders were already huddled in corners of the common room, talking about prototypes, funding rounds, and product-market fit. I felt wildly out of place, the warehouse girl among visionaries. But within a week, I met 3 people who changed everything. Maya, the operations expert, had the kind of energy that filled every room. She'd once managed logistics for disaster relief NGOs and could turn chaos into order with a whiteboard and a marker. Luis, the data scientist, was quiet, introspective, and brilliant, the kind of person who saw patterns in clouds, numbers, and people alike. And Priya, the product designer, believed technology should feel like compassion, not code. The 4 of us clicked in a way I can only describe as inevitable. We started spending nights sketching models on napkins and arguing over ethical algorithms. Somewhere between the caffeine and exhaustion, we realized we weren't just building a tool, we were building a philosophy. We called our project North Chair Analytics. The name came to me one night as we watched the city lights from the roof of the dorm. "It's about navigation," I told them. "Finding true north, building your own seat when none was offered." They loved it. The metaphor became our anchor: build a table, then add chairs. That's what Grandma had done for me, and that's what I wanted to do for others: create a space where fairness wasn't charity but design. The months that followed were brutal and beautiful. We survived on coffee, instant noodles, and hope. The accelerator's shared workspace became our second home. I coded until my wrists ached. Luis built dashboards that looked like constellations. Maya pitched to partners with that unstoppable grin. And Priya redesigned our logo at least 100 times until it felt human. Every setback hit hard. Every small win felt like electricity. When we launched our beta platform to track inventory equity for small retailers, I watched the first live dashboard light up like a heartbeat on the screen. We'd done it: turned silence into structure, invisibility into data that mattered. Mark, the investor who'd first found me at the warehouse, visited the demo day. Afterward, he pulled me aside and said, "You've got something special here, Evelyn. You're solving the fairness problem without preaching it." He became our first angel investor, offering $75,000 in seed funding. It wasn't a fortune, but to us, it felt like the universe finally saying yes. That night, The four of us went to a late-night diner to celebrate. The table was sticky, the fries were cold, but I remember laughing until my cheeks hurt. Somewhere between sips of lukewarm coffee, Maya leaned across the table and said, "You know what's wild? You built something to make people seen. And now you're finally being seen too." Her words hit deeper than she realized. For years, I had built my life around invisibility, around earning worth through service. But here, with them, I didn't have to shrink. We weren't competing for space, we were building it. Over the next year, North Chair grew faster than any of us expected. We partnered with local grocery chains, helping them cut waste and redistribute surplus stock to food banks. We built predictive dashboards that showed not just what was missing, but where abundance could go instead. Every time we onboarded a new client, I felt like I was patching a small piece of the world that had been broken. For the first time, fairness wasn't a dream, it was measurable. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stay alone in the office, watching the data points drift across the screen like stars. I'd pull out Grandma Helen's notebook and run my thumb over her old handwriting. Just because there's no applause doesn't mean you're not shining. But now, the room was full of light computer monitors, city skylines, the reflection of my own face in the glass. It struck me then, maybe this was what she meant by shining quietly. I hadn't built North Chair to prove anything to my family. I'd built it for the people no one saw, for the overlooked shelves, the forgotten workers, the small stores on back roads that kept communities alive. I'd built it because fairness, like light, was meant to be shared. As the city slept outside, I looked at the glow of our logo North Chair Analytics and whispered the rule that would become our company's heartbeat. Build a table, then add chairs. In that moment, I didn't need applause, validation, or even acknowledgement. I had something better, a direction. The door that had cracked open in that warehouse was now wide, and for the first time in my life, I stepped through it without looking back. The next 18 months were the steepest climb of my life. Success, it turned out, didn't arrive with trumpets or champagne. It came wrapped in exhaustion, late rent, and the bitter smell of burnt coffee at 2 in the morning. Our little office sat on the 4th floor of an old co-working space in Chicago's West Loop, wedged between a tattoo parlor and a failing VR startup. The building's air conditioner groaned in summer, the radiators hissed in winter, and the walls carried every sound: the low buzz of ambition, the laughter of people pretending not to be terrified. We lived on instant noodles and vending machine granola bars. Sometimes Maya and I shared one cup of coffee, alternating sips like it was communion. The only time we splurged was when Luis's code finally ran without crashing. Then we'd order a single deep dish pizza and eat it cold hours later because none of us could stop debugging long enough to take a break. Every month we calculated our burn rate like it was a countdown clock. The numbers never looked good. But we kept moving because stopping meant sinking. By the 3rd quarter, we'd built a solid proof of concept, a predictive model for hospital supply chains that could flag shortages of critical equipment before they happened. It was a desperate pivot. Hospitals were drowning in inefficiency, and we knew our model could save both money and lives. We pitched it to anyone who would listen: administrators, procurement officers, anyone with a LinkedIn account and a pulse. Most ignored us. A few listened out of politeness. One night, we found ourselves presenting in a fluorescent conference room to a panel of exhausted hospital directors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Maya clicked through the slides, Luis explained the algorithm, and I told the story the way I always did about fairness, visibility, and how systems could be kinder if designed to notice everyone. When we finished, the room was silent. I thought we'd failed again. But then a woman in a gray suit leaned forward and said, "If you can really reduce shortages by even 10%, you'll change everything." 2 weeks later, we were onboarding our first pilot client, a small network of hospitals in Illinois. Those first few months were chaos. We worked around the clock, cleaning dirty data, chasing server errors, sleeping on beanbags under our desks. But when the quarterly report arrived, it showed a 30% drop in supply shortages across all 5 hospitals. 30%. I remember the night Maya printed the report and spread it across our desks like it was sacred scripture. 30, she whispered. We did it. We stared at the numbers until dawn, the glow of the monitors painting our faces in blue light. No confetti, no applause, just quiet awe. For the first time, our work had weight. It mattered. The results attracted attention. Investors who had once ghosted our emails suddenly wanted meetings. Within 3 months, we closed our seed round. Mark came on board again, this time joined by 2 healthcare angels who believed in ethical tech. It wasn't much $1.2 million, but to us, it felt limitless. We finally upgraded from folding chairs to real ones, with cushions that didn't squeak. I remember running my hands along the smooth oak of our new conference table, the first thing we'd ever bought brand new. Luis laughed and said, "It's official, we have our own table now." Still, the climb didn't stop. Growth demanded everything. Longer hours, tougher calls, sharper decisions. We learned to pitch under pressure, to lose gracefully when deals slipped away. We stumbled, we argued, we broke down and built each other back up again. But through it all, the 4 of us held on to that quiet rule: build a table, then add chairs. Our big break came 18 months in, when a national retail chain reached out. They'd read about our hospital success in an industry report and wanted to pilot our model across their Midwest stores. It was the opportunity we'd dreamed of, and the one that nearly destroyed us. The scope was massive, the deadlines brutal, and the expectations sky high. For weeks, we barely left the office. I remember typing through nosebleeds, Maya falling asleep on the floor with her laptop open, Luis whispering to the servers like they were living things. But when the pilot results came in, they showed something staggering. A 32% reduction in product shortages, millions saved in logistics costs, and a measurable boost in customer satisfaction. The chain expanded our contract, then recommended us to others. Overnight, Northchair Analytics went from a scrappy, unknown startup to a serious contender in predictive logistics. That's when the press started calling. We were featured in a mid-tier tech magazine under the headline, "Fairness in Data, the Quiet Revolution of Northchair." The article painted me as some sort of visionary, which felt surreal considering I was still eating ramen and sleeping on a futon. My picture, a candid shot from demo day, showed me sitting on stage beside an empty chair. I hadn't noticed it until later, but when I did, it stopped me cold. That chair. It was supposed to be for family or special guests, the program coordinator had told us. I'd left it empty. My parents hadn't come, and I hadn't asked them to. When the article circulated online, people commented on the symbolism of the image, the founder beside an unfilled seat, representing inclusivity, humility, progress. They saw poetry in it. I saw memory. A week after the article came out, my phone buzzed with a message from home. I opened it, expecting congratulations, but it wasn't that. My mother had texted, "Your sister's birthday dinner is on Saturday. Can you make it this year? She'd love to see you." No mention of the article, the company, the hospital contract, just the same orbit around Claire. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Can't, work trip." Then I turned off my phone. It hit me how strange it was how I could build systems that predicted the movement of thousands of products across hundreds of miles, but I couldn't predict a single gesture of pride from my own family. Maybe that's why I worked so hard, because every line of code, every efficiency metric, was a way of rewriting the laws of neglect. Machines could learn fairness. Maybe people could too. As the company grew, so did the noise: investors, reporters, competitors, but inside, I carried a silence that felt heavier each day. Every time I saw that empty chair in photos or on stage, it reminded me who hadn't shown up. Not out of malice, but indifference, and sometimes that hurt worse. Still, I kept going. We raised our Series A $8 million from a top-tier fund. The night the deal closed, Maya popped cheap champagne in the office. Foam spilled across the floor, and we laughed until our sides hurt. But even in that joy, I found myself glancing at the extra chair by the conference table, the one we always kept open for future hires. It sat there quietly in the glow of our monitors, untouched, waiting. Maybe part of me was still that girl at the science fair, staring at a row of empty seats. But this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to fill them. I was learning to build my own. And though I didn't know it yet, that chair empty, patient, symbolic would follow me all the way to the night my family finally noticed what I'd become. 18 months after that first photo of me beside the empty chair ran in Tech Horizon, everything shifted again, but this time, the silence that followed wasn't from being unseen. It was the silence that comes right before thunder. Our hospital and retail clients had been running North Chair's systems for 2 years now, and though the results were impressive, I could feel the limits closing in. Forecasting supply chains based on historical data worked until the world changed overnight. The pandemic, the strikes, the political instability, all of it had exposed how fragile predictability really was. We weren't failing, but we were stagnating. Then one evening, as I watched Luis run simulations on our outdated models, something clicked. "We're looking backward," I said. He frowned. "That's how forecasting works." I shook my head. "No, we're teaching the machine to remember when we should be teaching it to anticipate." That one sentence turned into 6 months of reinvention. We pivoted from predictive analytics to adaptive intelligence AI that could self-correct in real time across multiple channels: hospital supply, retail demand, agriculture distribution. It didn't just project trends, it learned from volatility. Luis rewrote entire architectures. Maya built the infrastructure deals. Priya turned complex models into dashboards any human could understand. And me? I barely slept. I felt like I was watching something alive come to consciousness. Our beta tests were staggering. One retailer using our adaptive model reported a 40% reduction in waste within 2 quarters. A hospital chain in Texas used our system to predict ICU supply needs during an unexpected flu outbreak, saving hundreds of lives by ordering early. When the data came in, I sat in the dark conference room and whispered, "This is bigger than us." That's when the call came. A Fortune 100 global logistics conglomerate, one of the largest in the world, wanted an exclusive 5-year contract to integrate North Chair's AI forecasting system across their entire multi-continent operation. The deal was astronomical. 5 years, licensing rights, integration fees, shared revenue. We'd never seen numbers like it. I remember the night the deal was finalized. The rain hammered the windows of our glass office, the city below a blur of neon reflections. Maya, Luis, and Priya were huddled beside me as I read the final line out loud. "Upon execution, North Chair Analytics will become the preferred predictive partner for Horizon Global." Then I looked up, half laughing, half crying. We just built something the world can't ignore. The contract triggered a cascade. Within weeks, investors were circling again. Mark called from New York, practically vibrating through the phone. "Do you realize what you've done? This isn't just a deal, it's a proof of concept for the next decade of AI infrastructure." The seed that started in a freezing warehouse had become something enormous. We raised a Series C round at a valuation north of $1 billion. The press used words like unicorn, visionary founder, AI revolution. I smiled for the cameras when I had to, but inside, I felt strangely detached. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I was protecting something sacred. When the valuation hit the news, my inbox exploded. Old classmates, local journalists, even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. But not my parents. Not Claire. Through that Series C, our early investors took some liquidity, and I exercised part of my RSUs through a structured secondary sale, completely legal, completely quiet. Overnight, on paper, my net worth crossed $200 million. I didn't tell anyone except my lawyer and my accountant. It wasn't a number I wore like a crown. It was a measure of the distance between who I'd been and who I had become. I was the girl who once fixed radios in a garage that smelled like dust and oil. Now I could buy the building that garage stood in 10 times over. But I didn't. I didn't buy anything new. I didn't even move apartments. I still wore the same gray sweaters, still carried my scuffed brown tote bag from college, still preferred worn-out sneakers to heels. Luis once teased me about it. You know you can afford a stylist now, right? I laughed. I don't need one. I already know who I am. While the world was busy turning North Chair into a headline, I quietly set up something else, a foundation. The Helen Moore Foundation for Equity in Education and Nutrition. It funded scholarships for girls in small Midwestern towns who wanted to study data science or engineering and built local food banks that used our AI systems to distribute surplus food efficiently. I didn't hold press conferences or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I just signed the papers, wired the funds, and wrote her name, Helen Moore, in the founding documents with my own pen. When the foundation's first scholarship recipient sent me a letter thanking me for believing in invisible girls, I sat at my desk for a long time before replying. I told her, "You don't owe me gratitude. Just promise me this, build your own table, and when you do, add more chairs." Life became a blur of meetings, conferences, and cautious celebration. North Chair moved into a new headquarters, a minimalist glass structure overlooking the Chicago River, but my office was still small, with a single oak chair by the window and Grandma's old leather notebook displayed in a frame. On the first page, faded from time, were her words. "Just because there's no applause doesn't mean you're not shining." I'd shine quietly, just as she taught me. No sports cars, no designer logos. Just impact. Every dollar I made had to mean something. We hired 120 new employees, expanding into Europe and Asia. We built tools that predicted disaster relief shortages before storms even formed. The work became our language of gratitude. And yet, success didn't erase loneliness, it just made it quieter. Sometimes, at the end of a 14-hour day, I'd sit in the dark office and scroll through my phone. My parents' names were still in my contacts, untouched, like relics from another life. There were no new messages, no congratulations, no "we're proud of you." Only Claire's endless stream of Instagram posts, dinners, vacations, galas with captions like "grateful for family." I didn't resent them anymore. I'd stopped expecting anything. But sometimes, I caught myself wondering, did they even know? Did they realize the daughter they forgot had built something that touched millions of lives? When North Chair crossed $1 in valuation, the team insisted on celebrating. We rented out the rooftop of the building and ordered cheap champagne again, just for tradition's sake. As the city lights flickered below, Maya raised a glass. "To Evelyn," she said, "who built the table we all sit at." Everyone clapped, and for a moment, the sound filled every quiet place that had once hurt. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, I stayed behind. The wind was cold, sharp off the river. I looked out at the city, the skyline glittering like code, and whispered to myself, "This is what showing up looks like." Then I smiled, thinking of Grandma Helen, of the dusty garage, of that old notebook, and the girl who once wondered if she'd ever be seen. She had been seen now. Not because she shouted, not because she sought revenge, but because she kept building in silence until the world had no choice but to notice. And still, she wore the same sweater. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening in November, just as the last leaves of the Chicago maples were falling outside my apartment window. It was from my mother. Short, polite, perfectly measured, like a note you'd send to a distant acquaintance rather than your child. "Thanksgiving năm nay về cho vui. Cả nhà sẽ có mặt. Claire cũng rất mong gặp con." The English translation, though she'd never written it that way, was painfully simple. "Come home for Thanksgiving. It'll be nice to have you. Claire will be there too." There was no "we miss you," no "we're proud of you," not even a "how have you been?" Just a hollow formality wrapped in domestic civility. After years of silence, It felt less like an invitation and more like an afterthought, like being penciled into a guest list at the last minute to fill an empty seat. I stared at the message for a long while, then typed my reply. Okay. No exclamation mark, no emojis, no hint of warmth. Just that single word. That night, as I packed, I chose carefully. I didn't bring gifts or wine or even one of the polished talking points people expected from a founder. Instead, I carried two things: a bouquet of wild daisies, Grandma Helen's favorite, and a small white place card. On it, in black ink, I wrote, "For who shows up." The drive back to Indiana took 4 hours, though it felt longer. The roads grew emptier the farther I went, the skyline fading into flat fields and broken fences. The town hadn't changed much, still the same diner, the same church steeple, the same quiet that used to smother me. As I passed the sign that read, "Welcome to Brookfield," I felt something twist in my chest. It wasn't nostalgia, it was muscle memory. The ache of coming home to a place that never truly held you. Their house looked smaller than I remembered. White paint peeling, the porch light buzzing faintly. Through the window, I could see silhouettes moving around the dinner table, laughter, motion, the clink of dishes. The same choreography as always. I parked down the street, took the bouquet and the card, and walked up the driveway, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots like distant thunder. When Mom opened the door, her smile was the same one she used on church neighbors, polite, practiced. "Evelyn," she said, like tasting the name for the first time in years. "You made it." I did," I said simply. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and turkey fat, warm and familiar. The dining table gleamed under the yellow light, set with the same china they used every year. My old seat was there, at the corner by the window, the same corner where I used to sit at birthdays and holidays, where the place card always spelled my name wrong. I walked over, set the bouquet gently on the chair, and slid the white card in front of the plate. My mother noticed but said nothing. The words "for who shows up" faced the rest of the table like a quiet mirror. Claire was radiant as ever, wrapped in soft beige cashmere, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "You look good," she said, in the tone people use when they're surprised you do. "I saw something online about your company. What's it called again?" "North Chair," I said. "Right, yes." She turned immediately back to her husband, laughing. "Anyway, as I was saying, our boutique just launched a second location in Nashville. Can you believe it? We sold out of our winter collection in 3 days." Mom beamed. "That's wonderful, honey. You've worked so hard." The conversation moved around the table like a current I couldn't enter. They talked about Claire's shop, her husband's promotion, their new house, their upcoming ski trip. Every time someone asked a question, it was about her. When I was addressed, it was almost accidental, like they remembered I was there mid-sentence. "Evelyn, you're still in Chicago, right?" Dad asked, slicing his turkey. "I am." Good, good." He paused, chewing thoughtfully. "You're still doing all right then?" There it was. The old, familiar question. Not curiosity, not concern, just an obligation, a polite nod to the fact that I existed. "I'm doing fine," I said evenly, spooning cranberry sauce onto my plate. The tartness hit my tongue like a spark, sharp, real. Around me, laughter continued. Someone refilled Claire's wine glass. Someone complimented her earrings. I kept eating quietly, listening to the rhythm of their conversation as if from another room. Nothing had changed. Not the way they looked at her. Not the way they looked through me. For years, I had thought time might soften that truth. It hadn't. At one point, Mom turned to me. "You should have told us you were coming. We would have saved a nicer seat." I smiled faintly. "This one's just right." Her eyes flickered to the daisies on the chair beside me, then down to the place card. She didn't comment, but I saw her hand tighten briefly around her glass. The dinner stretched on. Claire told a story about a designer she'd met in New York, Dad interrupted to talk about a mutual friend's new car. Mom fussed about pie crusts and table linens. I laughed when it was polite, nodded when required, answered questions with measured brevity. The whole time, I felt the soft hum of distance between us, polished, practiced, impenetrable. When dessert came, Claire leaned back and sighed dramatically. "It's so good to have everyone together again," she said, reaching for her husband's hand. "It's been years, hasn't it?" I looked at her, then at the daisies. "Yes," I said softly. "Years." No one asked what those years had been filled with. No one asked where I'd been, what I'd built, or why the bouquet was sitting there. And for the first time, that silence didn't wound me, it confirmed something I'd always known. They hadn't changed because they'd never needed to. When the plates were cleared and the laughter began to fade, I excused myself quietly. I left the bouquet on the chair, the petals catching the candlelight like small suns. The place card remained, the ink still drying slightly. For who shows up? No one noticed when I slipped out. I drove away under the cold November sky, the road ahead glittering with frost. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it disappeared completely. For years, I had wondered what homecoming would feel like. Now I knew, it wasn't fireworks or reconciliation. It was knowing you could walk into the same room, sit at the same table, and realize you no longer needed to be seen to know your worth. The daisies would wilt by morning, but the chair, they would remember that chair. The next morning, the air in the house smelled like reheated stuffing and unresolved tension. Thanksgiving had technically ended, but my parents always hosted a leftovers brunch the next day, as if repeating the ritual could fix the cracks in the foundation. I'd stayed overnight at a small inn by the edge of town instead of the guest room. They hadn't offered it anyway, and when I arrived, everyone was already seated at the table again. Same china, same chatter, same hierarchy of voices. Claire was radiant in another soft sweater, her laughter cutting through the clink of silverware. Mom flitted around pouring coffee, while Dad read the local paper out loud about gas prices like it was national news. The same domestic loop, frozen in time. Halfway through the meal, my uncle, a friendly man with more enthusiasm than tact, looked up from his plate and said, "So, Evelyn, what are you doing these days? Still in Boston?" He said Boston because, to him, any place with tech and cold weather was Boston. I smiled politely. "Chicago, actually." "Ah." He nodded, pretending to remember. "And you're still doing that computer thing, right? What's it called again? North something." Across the table, I saw Claire's mouth twitch into a half smirk. "Yeah," she said, reaching for her mimosa. "She's got some little startup, right? You must be so busy, Ev." The nickname slid out like a pat on the head. I set down my fork, the tines glinting in the morning light. "A little busy," I said, matching her tone. "We just closed our Series C funding round last month." "Jew?" Dad glanced up, confused. "Series what now?" "Series C," I repeated casually, as if it were the most ordinary phrase in the world. "It's just a later investment stage. We raised a bit over $200 million in total." The sound that followed wasn't silence, it was a collective pause, the kind that lives between disbelief and dawning comprehension. My uncle's coffee spoon froze halfway to his mouth. The carving knife Dad had been using to slice the cold turkey hesitated midair. Mom's hand, holding her wine glass, trembled just enough for the light to catch the movement. Claire's smile faltered, the word 200 hung in the air like smoke. I took a sip of water and continued, tone steady, conversational. "We're also funding a food distribution program for this region. The North Chair Foundation partnered with a few local pantries. You might have seen the trucks there marked with the red compass logo." Mom blinked slowly. "That's you?" I nodded. "Yes. Grandma's name is on the foundation charter, actually. The Helen Moore Initiative. She would have liked that, don't you think?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Across the table, Claire was staring straight at me, her hand frozen around her glass stem. Her diamond bracelet caught the sunlight like a flashbulb. "Wait," she said, voice half whispered, half accusing. You mean that North chair? The one in Forbes last month? That's your company? I shrugged lightly. Well, our company. There are 4 of us. But, yes. Dad cleared his throat. And you own part of it? I turned my head toward him, keeping my expression neutral. I do. I hesitated, as if debating whether to elaborate, then said, almost offhandedly. Based on last week's valuation, my portion's worth around paused. I paused, squinting slightly as if doing mental math. 200 million, give or take. But you know how these things fluctuate. The room went utterly still. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Dad's tie had slipped crooked. Mom's wineglass was suspended halfway to her lips. Claire's jaw had literally dropped, her fork dangling in midair. The turkey knife still hung over the platter, a thin strip of white meat clinging to the blade. For a full 10 seconds, no one breathed. Finally, I smiled small, polite, weightless. Anyway, I said, glancing around, who wants more pumpkin pie? The air didn't move. It was as if the walls themselves were processing the sentence. Then, slowly, Mom blinked, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Oh, she stammered. We still have some in the kitchen. I nodded. Perfect. I rose, smoothing my sleeve, and crossed to the counter as if nothing had happened. The room remained frozen behind me, my father pretending to check the gravy boat, my uncle staring at his coffee, Claire still fixed in that stunned half-smile that looked almost like pain. As I sliced the pie, I could feel the weight of their silence pressing against my back. I plated each piece carefully, the scent of cinnamon and pumpkin filling the air, warm and sweet. When I returned to the table, everyone tried, clumsily, to recover. So, Dad said after clearing his throat again, that's quite an accomplishment. I smiled faintly. Thank you. Mom's voice followed, brittle but composed. We had no idea it was so successful. You should have told us. 1. I figured you'd see it eventually, I said, tone soft but steady. It's been on the local news a few times. Claire finally spoke, voice quiet, uncertain. Why didn't you ever say anything? I looked at her, really looked. The golden child, still playing the role she'd been handed, now realizing the script had changed without her. Because, I said gently, I didn't build it to be talked about. Another silence. Longer this time, heavier, the kind that reshapes the air. Mom tried to laugh, but it cracked halfway through. Well, she said, clinking her fork against her plate, isn't this something to be thankful for? I nodded. It is. And then, just like that, I took another bite of pie. Sweet, spiced, quiet. The simplest act in the world, and yet, somehow, it carried more power than any speech could. Around me, conversation stuttered, then tried to restart itself, but it couldn't find rhythm again. They were all still somewhere in that beat of disbelief, trying to realign their understanding of me. I let them. I didn't need to explain or correct or diminish. The truth had landed, and it spoke louder than anything I could have said. When I was a child, I used to dream of this moment not out of revenge, but as proof. Proof that the invisible could become undeniable. But sitting there now, watching the clock tick above the mantel, I realized the victory wasn't in their silence. It was in mine. Because I could sit at their table, calm, grounded, whole, and know that I no longer needed their approval to exist. Claire finally broke the quiet. So, are you hiring? The laughter that followed was nervous, brittle, and short-lived. I smiled again, steady. We're always looking for people who show up, I said simply, pushing the last bite of pie across my plate. The clock ticked again, steady, unbothered. And that was the music of power, the sound of peace mistaken for composure. Mom found me in the kitchen after everyone else had drifted into the living room, their laughter brittle and uncertain, trying to resettle around the new gravity of what had just happened. The plates were stacked high in the sink, steam rising from the dishwasher, the smell of cinnamon and turkey bones hanging in the air. She closed the door behind her as if the silence needed walls. "Evelyn," she began, her voice low and tremulous. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something before today?" She crossed her arms, half defensive, half bewildered. "You could have warned me. People will think we didn't support you, that we were out of touch." I turned to her slowly, the overhead light glinting off the stainless steel sink. "Mom," I said softly, "I did tell you. For years, every time I tried to talk about what I loved, what I was building, you changed the subject. Or you told me to let Claire speak first. I've been saying it all along, you just never listened." Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. For the first time in my life, I saw confusion in her face, not anger, not disapproval, just the slow dawning realization of absence. "I'm not blaming you," I continued, my tone steady, almost kind. "I just stopped trying. When you grow up being told to be quiet long enough, silence starts to feel like safety." She sank onto the nearest stool, the color draining from her face. "We never meant to make you feel that way." "I know," I said. "That's the hardest part, you didn't mean to. But it still happened." Through the doorway, the murmur of conversation carried faintly from the dining room. I could hear Claire's voice, softer than usual. Dad's, slower. Then his footsteps, heavy and uncertain, moving toward us. He paused in the doorway, holding the edge of the frame as if he needed to steady himself. "Evelyn," he said quietly. Can I sit?" I gestured toward the corner of the kitchen where a single chair stood tucked against the wall. The chair. The one that had been mine for years, the forgotten seat at the edge of every celebration. He pulled it out and lowered himself onto it slowly, as though afraid it might disappear. "I don't know what to say," he admitted after a moment. I thought you were doing fine, but I never imagined this." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "How many things have I missed?" I looked at him for a long time. The question was too big for words and too late for answers, but still, something in me softened. "A lot," I said gently. "But some things are still here to be seen." The kitchen clock ticked between us, a quiet metronome of all the time that had passed without conversation. Then Claire appeared in the doorway. Her voice was small, almost fragile. "Can I come in?" Mom nodded automatically, but Claire was looking at me. I gave a short nod. She stepped inside, her movements slower than I'd ever seen. Her eyes, so bright and certain a few hours ago, now looked unsteady, searching for footing. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I mean, I knew you were doing well, but I didn't see it. I just thought if you ever became successful." She hesitated, her voice cracking. "I'd disappear. Like there wouldn't be room for both of us." Her honesty disarmed me. I set down the dish towel I'd been holding. "Claire," I said, "you don't disappear because someone else shines. You disappear when you stop showing up." She blinked, eyes glassy, and nodded faintly. Without thinking, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small white place card I'd carried from the night before. The ink on it was slightly smudged from my hands, but the words were still clear, "For who shows up." I set it gently on the counter between us. "This," I said quietly, "is the new rule. In my life, in my home, in my heart. No borrowed emotions, no borrowed pride. If you want to sit at my table, all you have to do is show up fully, honestly. No pretending. No erasing." Mom stared at the card as if it were a verdict. Dad exhaled, long and shaky. Claire reached out and touched it with her fingertips, then looked at me. "Can we start over?" I gave a small smile. "That depends on whether you mean it." She didn't answer, but, for once, her silence wasn't defensive, it was humble. When I left later that evening, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No one followed me to the door, but as I stepped out, I caught a glimpse of Dad still sitting at that corner chair, staring at nothing. The place card lay in the center of the kitchen table now, next to the fading bouquet of daisies. Outside, the cold November air bit at my cheeks. The sky had turned the color of pewter, and snow threatened to fall. I got into my car, turned on the heater, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed a flurry of messages, lighting up the screen. It was already happening. Word had spread. A cousin had posted something vague. Turns out our family has a real genius in it. Who knew? Someone else had commented, "Wait, is this about that Forbes article?" Within an hour, I knew the group chats would be on fire. Old classmates, distant relatives, everyone dissecting the news like a headline. I didn't reply. I didn't correct. I didn't post a thing. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It was out there, moving through the world on its own. As I drove away, the town grew smaller in my rearview mirror. The same gas station, the same church steeple, the same rusted sign that once felt like the border of my world. But now, it was just a landmark in a story that had already turned its last page. At a red light, I rolled down the window slightly. The wind carried the faintest smell of wood smoke and pine, the scent of Grandma Helen's kitchen, alive in memory. I smiled. Somewhere, in some quiet ledger of the universe, I knew she'd be proud, not because of the money or the company, but because I had finally learned her lesson. You don't build a life to be seen. You build it so others can stand on it. By the time I reached the highway, the first snowflakes began to fall, drifting lazily through the headlights. The road stretched open ahead of me, wide, endless, free. And behind me, in that old kitchen, a single place card waited on the table, a small white promise under the hum of the refrigerator. For who shows up? The next morning, the air was sharp and silver with early winter light. I left town before sunrise, my car cutting through the fog that clung low over the fields. The highway was quiet, a long ribbon of gray stretching between past and future. For the first time in years, I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving towards something I'd built with my own hands. The local food bank sat on the edge of the industrial district, housed in an old warehouse that used to store fertilizer. Now it smelled of fresh bread, citrus, and hope. The front wall bore the name, the Helen Moore Foundation, in clean bronze letters. Below it, workers in red North Chair vests were unloading boxes, produce, canned goods, medical supplies from trucks marked with our Compass logo. I parked and walked up the gravel path, my boots crunching softly. Inside, volunteers were laughing, sorting donations, handing out hot cocoa to families waiting in line. A little girl waved at me from behind a table of apples. She couldn't have been older than 8. "You're Miss Moore, right?" she said shyly. "Mom says this place helps a lot of people." I knelt to her height. "That's the idea," I said, smiling. "It's your place too." She grinned, not fully understanding but feeling it anyway. Children always did. I gave her a sticker with our red compass emblem and watched her run off to show her mom. Near the entrance hung a new wooden plaque that hadn't been there on my last visit. Someone on the team must have installed it overnight. I stepped closer to read the inscription carved in looping script. "You don't need to be invited to belong. Build your own chair." My throat tightened. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Grandma Helen would have loved it plain wood, no gold, no marble, just truth. I traced my fingertips over the carved letters, feeling the grain under my skin. In that moment, I realized that this place, this work, was the table she had been teaching me to build all along. When I stepped back outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, hesitant flakes that caught on my hair and melted instantly. I sat in the car for a long time, letting the heater hum quietly, thinking about everything that had happened. Then I picked up my phone and scrolled to Mom. For a minute, I hesitated. The last time we'd spoken, the air between us had been thick with words unsaid. But healing isn't silence, it's invitation. When she answered, her voice was careful. "Evelyn? Hi, Mom. Number 4. A pause. Are you home safe?" "I am," I said. "I'm actually at the foundation site. It's running well." "That's good." Another pause, softer this time. I saw the article about the food bank on Facebook. Your aunt sent it to me. It's beautiful. I smiled faintly. Thank you. Then I took a breath. Next week, I'm giving a small talk at the community center downtown. Not TED or anything, just a session for first-year students about tech and opportunity. Nothing fancy. But if you'd like to come, you should come early. It might get crowded. She didn't respond right away. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing, the weight of consideration. Finally, she said, almost in a whisper, I'd like that. Maybe your father too. That'd be nice, I said. There'll be a seat for you. After we hung up, I sat there, phone still in my hand, watching the snow swirl outside. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was a beginning, a small, deliberate act of showing up. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the old family house one last time before heading back to Chicago. No one was home, but the curtains in the living room were drawn back, and the faint glow of a lamp filled the space. Through the window, I could see the dining table empty now, stripped of its holiday grandeur. And in the corner, on the chair where I had once sat forgotten, someone had placed a simple glass vase filled with wild daisies. Next to it, resting against the plate, was the white place card I'd left behind. For who shows up? The handwriting was still mine, but the meaning had grown larger than me. It wasn't just a boundary anymore, it was an invitation, a map. I stood there for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass, and smiled. That chair no longer belonged to the girl who waited to be seen. It belonged to anyone brave enough to arrive. When I finally turned to leave, the snow had begun to fall heavier, blanketing the street in soft white silence. The world looked reset, clean, forgiving. I thought of Grandma again, of her kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and rain, of her voice whispering, "You don't need applause to shine." As I drove toward the city, the radio played quietly, a song I didn't recognize but somehow felt written for this moment, steady, unhurried, at peace. In the distance, the skyline of Chicago shimmered like a promise. They forgot me for years. I learned to remember myself first. $200 million was never the goal. It's just what happens when you stop asking permission to exist. And when you build a table of your own, don't lock the door. Pull up more chairs. 1. The screen would linger on that final image. The old corner chair, now holding a vase of daisies under soft afternoon light. The place card resting quietly beside it, waiting for whoever chooses to show up next.